He was found lifeless, floating unclothed on the back of the most notorious killer whale in captivity. His name was Daniel Dukes, and his death would reignite a firestorm over SeaWorld, animal captivity, and the chilling power of one orca, TILIKUM. This is the disturbing story of a young man who slipped past the gates, sought solace in a giant predator, and never returned. Daniel P. Dukes was 27 years old in the summer of 1999. Friends described him as eccentric, adventurous, but also struggling with his direction in life. He had bounced between jobs, lived a nomadic existence, and most curiously, was fascinated by animals. He wasn't a criminal, nor someone seeking notoriety, but Daniel harbored an unusual dream, to be close to whales. To many, that was an abstract desire. To him, it was an obsession. The night of July 5th, 1999, SeaWorld Orlando, July 5th. The last fireworks of the Independence Day weekend had faded from the sky. The park had gone silent, emptied of the thousands of tourists who only hours before had crowded the stands, pointing cameras at the massive orca tanks. Security swept through the grounds with flashlights, ensuring the rides were locked, the gates secured. The laughter, the applause, the recorded music of Shamu Stadium, all of it evaporated into the Florida night. But unknown to them, one visitor never left. Daniel Dukes slipped into the shadows and vanished among the quiet structures of the park. How he did it, no one could ever fully explain. He had a plan, and it did not involve returning home. Carrying nothing but the clothes on his back, he wandered through the empty walkways until he stood before the largest tank of them all. Beneath the surface, a giant shadow stirred. It was TILIKUM, the 12,000-pound orca, a creature whose very name carried a history of death. For Daniel, this was no coincidence. He hadn't stumbled here by chance. Earlier that very day in his own journal, he had scribbled words that would later shake investigators. He wanted to be one with the whale. This wasn't a suicide note in the traditional sense. There was no message of despair, no farewell to family. It was something stranger, almost spiritual. Daniel believed, or desperately hoped, that the whale would accept him, that TILIKUM would not see him as an intruder, but as a companion. And so, Daniel Dukes lingered at the edge of the tank, staring into the dark water, waiting for the moment when man and killer whale would finally meet. TILIKUM wasn't just any orca. By 1999, he was already notorious in marine circles. His story began in the frigid waters off Iceland in 1983, where he was captured as a young whale, torn violently from his pod, separated from his family forever. From the very start, his life was marked by trauma. He was sold to SeaWorld of the Pacific, a small marine park in British Columbia. The tanks there were unforgiving, shallow, cramped, and unable to contain a creature that could reach more than 20 feet in length. Trainers would describe the whales at SeaWorld as stressed and unpredictable, and TILIKUM suffered the most. He was often bullied by the females, isolated, and left floating in corners with nowhere to go. Then in 1991, the unthinkable happened. During a routine day at the park, a young trainer named Kelty Burns slipped into the pool. She never came out alive. Witnesses reported the whales surrounding her, blocking her escape, dragging her under the surface. At the center of it was TILIKUM. Kelty Burns' death was the first recorded fatality caused by orcas in captivity, and it changed the perception of these gentle giants forever. When SeaWorld closed its doors in the aftermath, SeaWorld stepped in. In 1992, they acquired TILIKUM, not just for his size. At over 12,000 pounds, he was the largest orca in captivity, but for something even more valuable: his genetics. TILIKUM became SeaWorld's prize breeding male, fathering over 20 calves and spreading his lineage across the entire captive orca population. But even inside SeaWorld's glittering empire, a shadow followed him. Trainers knew he could be dangerous. They described him as unpredictable, sometimes aggressive, and almost always isolated in a tank far too small for his massive body. He was used in shows but rarely allowed the same intimate interactions that other whales had with their trainers. Management knew the risks, and they kept their distance. To most, TILIKUM was a symbol of fear and power, but to Daniel Dukes, none of this mattered. He didn't see the scars of captivity, the history of death, or the warning signs whispered by those who worked with the animal every day. He saw something else entirely: To Daniel, TILIKUM was not a captive predator, but a misunderstood soul, a creature he longed to embrace, even if it meant stepping into the dark water of his tank alone. Sometime after midnight, Daniel Dukes stripped down to his underwear, folded his clothes neatly, and slipped into the water of TILIKUM's pool. What happened next can never be fully known, but the evidence tells a story darker than any SeaWorld show could reveal. The next morning, staff arrived to a horrifying sight. TILIKUM was swimming laps with a human body draped across his back. It was Daniel, lifeless, mutilated. The autopsy revealed multiple abrasions and contusions, consistent with being held and dragged, drowning as the official cause of death, and gruesomely, evidence of severe trauma, including bite marks and even dismemberment. The coroner reported that certain body parts were missing, likely consumed or destroyed by the whale. It wasn't a quick drowning, it was violent. SeaWorld tried to downplay the horror. Their official statement, Daniel Dukes had trespassed, ignored warning signs, and died because of his own reckless choices. They insisted TILIKUM wasn't to blame. He was an animal acting on instinct. The narrative painted Dukes as unstable, even suicidal, but critics pointed out disturbing truths, that SeaWorld had failed to secure the tanks, that they had acquired an orca with a known deadly history, and once again, a human life had been lost in a pool built for entertainment, not safety. Animal rights groups seized on the tragedy. PETA declared, SeaWorld killed Daniel Dukes as surely as if they had pulled him under themselves. Daniel Dukes was not the first, and tragically, he would not be the last. TILIKUM's history was stained with fatalities. In 1991, Kelty Byrne, dragged and drowned at Sealand, followed by Daniel Dukes, found lifeless on his back, and again in 2010. Dawn Bronchot, senior trainer at SeaWorld Orlando, violently killed during a performance. 3 deaths, 1 whale. No other captive orca in history has a record so grim. So why did this tragedy happen? Many marine biologists argue the answer lies not in TILIKUM's evil, but in captivity itself. Wild orcas travel up to 100 miles a day, living in pods using complex communication. In captivity, they are confined to small tanks, isolated, often mixed with whales from different pods, causing social stress. Aggression is rare in the wild, but in tanks it surfaces, sometimes fatally. TILIKUM's aggression wasn't random. It was the product of decades of confinement, frustration, and psychological torment. Daniel Dukes wasn't killed by a monster. He was killed by a 12,000-pound predator, broken by captivity, acting out impulses no human could control. It's easy to dismiss Daniel as foolish, a trespasser who invited his own death, but his story is more complex. He wasn't suicidal, according to family. He was searching for meaning, for connection, perhaps even for escape. He believed in the purity of whales, and perhaps in his own mind, he thought TILIKUM would embrace him as a friend. Instead, he became part of a nightmare. The Dukes case faded from headlines quickly, overshadowed by later deaths like Dawn Bronchot's. But within activist circles, it remained a chilling example of SeaWorld's negligence. When the documentary Blackfish was released in 2013, TILIKUM became infamous worldwide. His role in 3 deaths, including Daniel Dukes, cemented him as the symbol of the anti-captivity movement. Daniel himself, however, was largely forgotten. Rarely mentioned, often dismissed, sometimes ridiculed. Yet behind the tragedy was a real man whose life ended in the most violent way imaginable. On that July night in 1999, Daniel Dukes sought something impossible, a bond with a predator that the world itself had caged. Instead, he found death. His body became a grim testament to the dangers of captivity, the power of the ocean's top predator, and the haunting truth that some forces of nature can never be tamed. TILIKUM would go on to live until 2017. By then, he was a broken giant, ailing, scarred, infamous. But Daniel's name remains tied to him forever. Another chapter in a saga of exploitation, death, and the cost of keeping killers in glass prisons.